Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 69th Moggcast and the last of 2021. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg after another turbulent fortnight. Good afternoon, Jacob.
Good morning. Is it going afternoon? Yes, it is. It seems so early, but yes, it is good afternoon.
The days are rushing by, and these times are very confusing and disorientating for everyone. Let's discuss today a mixture of COVID, the variant, and Boris Johnson's leadership in recent events. And I thought I'd begin with a simple, factual question, because claims to this effect have done the rounds, and I don't know whether it's true or not. In relation to these parties, whether they were parties or not, we will discuss in a moment. I've seen it claimed that they could not have been illegal because what was illegal under the rules was not illegal on the Crown estate. Is that correct?
An investigation is being carried out by the Cabinet Secretary. I don't think there's any great discussion on technicalities. And as you know, people can smoke in the Palace of Westminster if they want to because it's got Crown immunity, but they don't. I don't think this type of hair splitting is what really matters. I think what people know is that the Prime Minister has worked stunningly hard and has been absolutely committed to the regulations. Just think, the Prime Minister last year himself had COVID, was isolated in the flat in 10 Downing Street. People weren't allowed to see him because he had COVID. He was extraordinarily unwell, and he was being taken bits of cold pizza left outside his door to keep him fed. This man has made the most enormous commitment to this country, to this nation, to lead us through the most difficult period in our modern history. He's done so with incredible drive and energy, and people are really trying to attack him, I think, unreasonably and unjustifiably.
We'll get back to the Prime Minister in a moment, but pretty clear from what you said that the answer to my question is yes.
No, I'm not saying yes or no. I don't know, but I don't actually think it matters. I think from the point of view of the public, and it's one of the great strengths of our legal system, is we are all equal under the law.
Just to be clear, you're saying you don't know whether or not
there is a Crown immunity.
Whether or not there is a Crown immunity which would enable parties perfectly licitly to have been held.
I don't think anybody is making that argument.
Well, it's not an argument. I'm simply trying to establish whether
what the law is.
What the law is.
I don't think anyone's trying to make that as a defence as to what may or may not have happened in Downing Street.
I understand that completely. And obviously no one would want to, in an atmosphere where people are claiming, rightly or wrongly, it's one rule for X and another rule for Y, they wouldn't be thrilled to discover that a whole category of parties they couldn't hold could be held in government property under Crown immunity. I understand that. I just wanted to clear the matter up.
And I don't know the
And
answer.
you don't know the answer. So just next, I wanted to try to get to the bottom in a perfectly neutral manner of when a party is or isn't a party. There's a difference, isn't there, between what's clearly a party. People are invited to an event and it goes on for a long time, and there are speeches and maybe people are wearing festive hats, maybe they're not. There is a difference between that and someone opening a bottle of wine at work at the end of the day in their office, isn't there?
If we were to crack open a bottle of wine now, would we turn the Moggcast into the Mogg Partycast? Of course, these are judgments, and habits of drinking and working have changed enormously, haven't they? That if you think of how Parliament was portrayed in this House, which I'm sure play you saw, excellent play, or more particularly, actually, in Yes Minister, when anyone ever goes into the Prime Minister's office in Parliament, that person immediately has a glass of whiskey or something. And when you come into my office in the House of Commons now, I don't offer you a glass of whiskey. Habits have changed. And how people define things change and evolve. I think the heart of it is that the government, particularly in Downing Street, have been working all hours, not just over COVID, because that is what they do. It is a very hard-working environment, and it has very long hours. And they have been dedicating themselves to helping see the country through the pandemic. And I think for that, they deserve praise.
What you were saying, in effect, is that some of the events that have been described as parties may not have been parties at all. Can I add one rider question?
Well, let me ask you a further question. If you are in the office at midnight, are you allowed to have something to eat?
Well, the next question would also follow from that, which would be, if you're in the office at midnight and you have something to eat, and you're a civil servant eating, is it any more or less a party than if a political aide is eating?
It must be the same, regardless of whether you are a political aide or a civil servant, logically.
And I'm asking whether it's possible or even likely to believe that, in fact, a lot of these events also included civil servants as well as political aides and the like.
Well, we'll have to see what the Cabinet Secretary comes up with. But, just before you came in, I had a sandwich sitting in here. I'm not saying that is the height of civilization. I don't think it is. I would rather have gone to the beefsteak to have a nice lunch properly. But time doesn't allow for that. And the people in Downing Street were not getting home to eat. They were eating, and consistently eating, at their desks.
Just remind our listeners when these two investigations are concluding. There's an investigation by Simon Gates, the Cabinet Secretary, and there's also the matter of the wallpaper with the Prime Minister's own keeper, as it were, of the ministerial code.
The Cabinet Secretary will take the time he needs to take to establish the facts. As regards the wallpaper, I think that's actually pretty clear. I think people... It's what you would expect. Not everybody wishes to support a Conservative government, and they wish to try and pretend things are not as they are. And so they have a go at the Prime Minister. But on the wallpaper issue, the Prime Minister has given a thoroughly accurate account of everything.
Do you think the BBC has got this whole matter out of proportion?
Well, it seems to be the only thing they're interested in. What proportion of their time is spent on Ukraine as opposed to these sorts of details? Of course the BBC wants to do this. It has a very strong agenda, which is about protecting its licence fee.
Is there any difference between the way the BBC's covered this and orthodox Conservative newspapers like the Daily Telegraph? And as far as I can see, everyone pretty much has been pretty damning about the events of the last week.
The BBC has an obligation of impartiality, and I would suggest its reporting has been more like that of the Daily Mirror than that of the Daily Mail.
Can I put this to you? This, in a way, is the big question. Perhaps there'll be sufficient letters will go into Graham Brady to force a challenge, and perhaps there won't. I don't know, though. I think the balance has shifted.
I have some experience of this. It is a very difficult thing to do. You may remember with the previous incumbent.
Well, you'll also remember that sometimes these things take time, but sometimes these things happen in the end.
I didn't get the letters that people said they had written.
The letters did go in the end, didn't they?
But that was in a very different circumstance, with a complete collapse of government policy in its most important policy.
So that was only a little while later, I think 6 months or so.
The vote came a few weeks later, and obviously Theresa May then won it.
The point I'm making is these things don't necessarily happen quickly. It can take time to force a Prime Minister out. As I say, maybe it will happen and maybe it won't.
Well, you will recall that in 1981, at the party conference, there was an attempt to remove Margaret Thatcher. And 9 years later, she was still there. 9 years and a couple of months later, she was gone. So being any political office is a leasehold, not a freehold. And people are always thinking that they can stir things up a bit if they're opponents of whoever the incumbent is. But we have a very strong, very charismatic, very effective Prime Minister who is a proved election winner. And I think anybody in their right mind will back him to the hill.
Do you think there's an element of seeking to destabilise him in the number of rebels we see being published in lists for tomorrow's, it will be today's, by the time the listeners hear this, today's vote? Are there people jumping onto the back of these difficulties who actually at heart don't really care about the COVID regulations? They just want Boris Johnson out.
I don't think that's broadly true. Steve Baker was one of Boris's great supporters and helped him to win the leadership election. There are a number of names that crop up of people who would metaphorically die in a ditch for the PM, but who are unhappy with the COVID regulations. And are there some opportunists? Well, one of your regular writers was having a pop at the PM, but he lost the whip from the PM, so you can't expect him to be Prime Minister's greatest admirer.
You said broadly, so I mean, you're saying in effect that some might be jumping on the bandwagon to destabilise the Prime Minister.
Judge not that you be not judged. It's not for me to ascribe dishonourable motives to people. They will know in their heart of hearts whether their motives are pure or impure.
The question that some of the colleagues are asking really boils down to this. If you're going to go, to use the type of metaphor that the older type of Conservative MPs sometimes uses, if you're going to go over the top for the government, you want to believe that when you look around, you're going to have the ministers behind you and the policy will stay stable. A famous example of when this didn't happen was the forestry privatisation that you will remember, and the colleagues got quite shirty about it. Isn't it a difficulty now that the colleagues are looking over their shoulder and they're thinking that sometimes the Prime Minister won't be there, that some things that he's said may not necessarily be true, some positions that he's taken he may resile from, and it's that that's destabilising his leadership more than anything else?
I think you have perhaps a selective memory, because Margaret Thatcher famously never U-turned, did she? Except over the pay to the miners and the steel workers in her first couple of years in office. Or do you remember the proposed sale of Land Rover to Ford? We like to look back on history when we see only the results of decision-making and assume that those decisions were cast in stone at an early stage. There is no government in history that has not listened to arguments, all come up against political obstacles, that has meant that some things have had to be altered. And the forestry case is a good one. It was a policy I thought was perfectly reasonable, actually, at the time. It ran headlong into very strong public opposition, and governments can't bang their head against a brick wall forever. I've discussed with you before the change of mind on Owen Paterson and accepted my own share of blame for that. Why did we do a U-turn? Well, because looking at the case before us, we had clearly put two things together that should have been separated. That when you read the report, there were things that had happened that should not have happened. But Owen had also been more heavily punished than one could expect a man reasonably to receive a punishment as by the death of his wife. And it was a mistake to bring these two together because they were separate, and therefore the approach had to be changed, and that happens in politics. And I'd say to all the reasonable listeners of the Moggcast, don't we all change our minds in life as we receive more information? Isn't that the natural course of events? What matters is whether we are getting the general thrust of government policy right. Now, here we are. We have delivered on Brexit. We have managed to save the economy through the pandemic. We have reopened the economy faster than any other country in Europe, as far as I can tell. And we had a vaccine rollout that means that we're able to do that. We have a clear direction of government, clear set of policies, clear outline of where we're going. That is being delivered on. Yes, of course, there's noise around it, but that's life.
Let's get on to COVID and Omicron. Aren't the rebels in a kind of well-protected position because of Keir Starmer. Whatever the size of the rebellion later today, and again, I'm assuming it's Tuesday rather than Monday when we're making the recording, however big the rebellion is, we believe as we sit here that Keir Starmer and Labour are going to vote with the government, so the motion will go through. Therefore, the rebels are completely insulated, aren't they, from political blowback, because the measures will come in. If they're enough to deal with Omicron, that's great. If they're not, the Prime Minister will come back to the House asking for further measures, and they will have to take a decision then. But they can't be blamed for anything that goes wrong.
It is always a very different calculation as a backbencher, which I was for a long time, and one who occasionally voted against the government, when you think, will my vote stop what the government is doing, or will the government do what it wants to do anyway? And am I indicating my ideological position rather than expecting a change in direction? Those are two different votes. It is always harder to vote against the government when you think the government may be defeated. The reason for that, as much as anything, is loyalty. That even if you think the government is wrong, you sometimes still don't want the government that you support to be defeated, because that is obviously not a good thing for the government.
So it's a bit easier for them to vote this afternoon against the government. And Starmer knows that, and they know Starmer knows that, and so on and so forth.
Yes, but I don't want to belittle their strength of feeling, which I think would be a mistake. I think they genuinely believe what they believe. I think they believe it very sincerely. And I think it's important that freedom is protected. I'd be more worried if freedom had no advocates. It's got strong advocates, and quite rightly, those strong advocates are in the Conservative Party. I actually happen to think the strongest advocate of them is the Prime Minister himself, who has never wanted to impose restrictions, but has recognised the necessity of them. And his support for them is, I think, very reassuring to those in the party who like liberty. So I think their motivations are sincere. But as a matter of pure politics, yes, it's always easier to vote against the government if you know the government is going to win anyway.
They're in a position where they can't be proved right, aren't they? Because if Omicron comes in larger numbers, which it will, and if the measures are sufficient, which they may be, the Prime Minister will be able to turn around and say, well, what made the difference was the measures and the boosters.
I wish life were as simple as that. I think that's a nice way of looking at it, but governments are always judged on the decisions that they make, and people come to a conclusion as to whether they think they were effective or not.
Of course, the other side of the argument is that the government is moving too late with Omicron and closing down too slowly. Now, I know Sage and the like, I hope I'm not maligning them, will always say that. They always want as far as I can see, tougher shutdowns than actually happen. But of course, they could be right, could they not? And it could well be that something, a variant that in itself is less fatal, but spreads more widely because it spreads fast, that could still cause a large number of hospitalisations and not the NHS, of course.
Well, I think, to go back to our earlier point, Sage, if you're on Sage, you always win by saying you should lock down. Because you're not responsible for the other side of the balance sheet. And if you lock down and there are 10 deaths, you say there would have been 100 if we hadn't locked down. If you lock down, there's only 1 death, you say there's still been 100 if we haven't locked down. You can always win that particular spin argument, I think. And it's why the government has to make decisions balanced on the variety of risks, the delayed hospital appointments, the mental health consequences, the effects on the lonely of having less human contact, and so on, the business consequences. So the government has to make these difficult choices. I think crucially it has tended to go with the grain of public opinion, which is why we have had compliance by consent rather than by enforcement. And I think that's been crucially important to the temper of the debate. We've had much less aggressive enforcement than has been necessary in some continental countries. So I think you make a perfectly reasonable point that nobody at this stage knows precisely how it will work, and therefore you have to make a balanced decision.
Do you feel, just standing aside for a moment from the politics of it, and who might be wrong and who might be right about what should be done, there's a difficulty here that has been underestimated, which was we've had the vaccines. We all thought we were, or most of us did, or many of us did, we were getting out of this. At last life is returning to normal, with all the normal problems that escape from this kind of event brings with it. Cost of living difficulties, inflation, the kind of argument that we were having at the time of party conference about the availability of lorry drivers and all, going back to normal. And then suddenly you look at the scene and you see, well, in a world in which not everyone is fully vaccinated, you get variants. A variant arrives, and it may take, 6 months to get a new form of vaccine that deals with it completely. And so you begin to wonder, could we be in the beginning of a long series of relaxations and then restrictions again until a new variant is found, going on, off. And we're never quite out of COVID, but we're never quite fully in it.
This is your Narnia winter that you
My
were writing
Narnia
about this
winter.
morning. My view is that you have to learn to live with COVID in the end, that we cannot switch the economy off and on every few months, that life is about taking risk. We all take risk during the course of our lives and we make decisions accordingly. We will want to take the vaccines that are available, and I've got my vaccine third dose booked in. I'm sure you've got yours booked in. I think it is the right course for people to take, and it's an urgent course for people to take. Having said all that, when you have taken your vaccine, you have taken your lateral flow test, you have taken such precautions, and I keep on opening the windows to keep a flow of air coming in, done the things that help, then you have to get on with life. And that's where we will end up with all diseases, ultimately, that people have to take a risk.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you.
I was just going to finish, actually, one thought. There was a very funny leader in The Sun last week, that was on Saturday morning, saying, if you're reading this after 1:30 in the afternoon, or whatever time it said, it's jolly good because the meteorite that was skimming across the Earth hasn't hit and we haven't all been destroyed. If you're reading it before, I hope you're all right at 1:30. And there are risks out there that are unknown to us and pass us by without us even realizing, unless we carefully read The Sun, that they're going to happen. Life is about taking and balancing risk. Government is there to help people with that, but life in the end has to be led.
And can I ask finally, since it's Christmas and the season of goodwill and all that, we're talking about risk. Is there a risk that someone sitting next to you at a carol concert this year may find you bursting into song?
That is a terrible risk. I actually went to the West Harptree carol concert on Saturday evening, and I did sing, but the person next to me was Sixtus, who wasn't too desperately upset by my singing.
Well, listeners will remember last year I asked you to sing us a verse of a carol. You very courteously declined. I'm not going to press you again on that, but I need to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, in the expectation that I will still find you here in office and we will meet again for a Moggcast in the new year. Thank you very much.
Well, I look forward to the Moggcast in the new year. Thank you very much too. And a Happy New Year and a very Merry Christmas. I hope people will feel they have a suitable level of celebration.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.